If you have a scary story you'd like to hear on the channel, then go to mariesfield.com and send it my way. And of course, thank you. This happened when I was still going to school on campus. I took night classes, which were from about 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. It was also about a 40-minute drive from my place, and for someone who didn't like highways, it could be a long drive. I was able to find a road that went parallel to the highway most of the way, but it did add a little time to my trip. For the most part, the drive was fine though. There was definitely less traffic, and the scene was prettier to look at, but if you were tired enough, the drive home could make it worse. Those nights, I typically had my music up super loud, listened to some kind of comedy show, or even called my boyfriend to talk to him in hopes of keeping me awake and focused on the road. However, on one of those nights, as I was driving home, I heard a pop followed by a loud grinding sound. Of course, my tire blew while driving home. It's around 10 at night, as I mentioned. It was a Friday, and I was just exhausted and ready for my day off, and this happened, causing me to have a bit of a meltdown. I pulled over on the shoulder and called my boyfriend to let him know what happened. He asked me if I wanted his help because he knew I typically tried to remedy these situations by myself. I always hated the concept that I must not know how to change a tire or other car stuff because I'm a girl, so I appreciated that he always asked instead of assuming. I told him I would do it, but I would be home late and told him the closest intersection I was at, just in case. I was always careful when I did this stuff, so I laid out my reflective stands that I kept in my car and started to put the jack in place to lift it. Once I got it all set up, I went and grabbed the tire iron and started working on it. The best part of this whole experience was that I had just replaced one of my tires because it had a nail in it that was not able to be fixed, but I could only afford to replace one, so I got a new one and had them all rotated. The old man at the shop was super sweet and offered to do the rotation for free since I was purchasing the tire in full. So of course, this would happen to a different tire. The icing on the cake was that they used a machine to put the lug nuts back on because they were hard as hell to undo. Through struggling and some mild cursing though, I finally got one off. As I was working on another, a car was driving by and it started slowing down. I expected them to check out the show or stop and ask if I needed help, but to my surprise, they just kept on driving by. So I kept trying to work at the lug nuts when I saw the headlights of another car coming from the opposite direction. This time, I watched as they slowed down and turned off onto the shoulder behind me, and out from the driver's side came some guy. I had a feeling I knew where this was going, so I already had my RBF going on. He approached and said hi, so I said hi back and continued working on my tire. He had that annoying chipper sound to his voice that I cannot stand. I typically got that when a guy was approaching me at a club, when I was with my friends, or doing something to my car at a gas station or something like this on the side of the road, and it honestly pisses me off. I'm sorry, I know that sounds mean, and I don't think all guys do it for the same reason, but it's just the vibe that I got. So when this guy did the same thing, I immediately knew where this conversation was going to go. As he got closer, he said, smiling, "It looked like you could use some help." I told him I was fine and that I had done this plenty of times before, hoping that would get him to leave, but my hopes failed. Then he irked me with the next obvious statement of, "Well, a pretty lady like you shouldn't have to do something like this by herself," and also asked, "Where's your man at to help you?" So, yes, I was kind of bitchy and responded with, I don't need something between my legs to change a tire, thank you. However, he seemed to like the abuse. He laughed and apologized and said he didn't mean to offend and just wanted to try and help. So instead, I thanked him for his offer, but again said I was fine. He put his hands up in defeat and stepped back to lean on my truck. As I struggled again to get them off, he then asked, "So you don't have a man then?" I stopped and asked him to just leave me alone when he tried to compliment me again and ask me out. So, as a last resort, I told him I wasn't single, and if I was, he wasn't my type. But this guy did not back down. He basically then said he didn't believe me and to prove it. Now I'm confused. How was I supposed to prove I had a boyfriend? I again told him I didn't need any help and to leave me alone, and his response was to get closer to me and said, "Or what? I don't see your boyfriend here to save you." That was the comment that scared me and made me realize I was on the side of a dark road in the middle of nowhere. I didn't really know what was around me and barely knew the road I was on and the intersection I just passed. Not to mention why I was there. I couldn't drive my car away with a blown tire and it being jacked up. So my intimidating act quickly dropped as he was hovering over me. I was about 5'2", and he was probably at least 6 feet, as I had to look up to see his face, which I did with my boyfriend, and he was 6'2". So I just told him to please let me be, as I just wanted to change this so I could get home. Giving up, I said, "If you think you can undo these faster, then feel free to help." So he backed up and laughed a little and said, "Why should I help you after the way you treated me?" I again apologized and told him I was just frustrated and wanted to go home, and said he didn't have to. Then he said I should make it up to him somehow. The look on his face said it all, and I just felt sick to my stomach. I again apologized and started stepping back to my driver door. The bad tire was the back driver's side, so I was already pretty close. He noticed I was doing this and started towards me as well, so I quickly turned to open my car door. He grabbed me by my waist and pulled me backwards, and all I could do was kick and flail and scream. As you might expect, he went to cover my mouth, and I bit down as hard as I could on his finger. He yelled something, calling me names, but as that hand was flailing, I was able to struggle out of his grasp and ran to my car. I got in and tried shutting the door, but he ran up to it, trying to keep me from shutting it, but I managed to slam his hand in it. He pulled back screaming again, and I quickly locked my doors and tried grabbing my phone to call someone. I noticed I had missed a call from my boyfriend, but being all over the place at the time, I had just called 911 first. While I was on the phone, I saw the guy standing there looking at me, but then he walked back to his car. Again, I was scared because my car was on a jack and there was no way I could leave. While on the phone, I saw another car driving up, but I had a feeling it wasn't an officer because it was too fast, and it didn't look like one of their cars. At this point, I became nervous because I could see the lights of the guy's car behind me, and now I have a car approaching and pulling over in front of me. Then I recognized the car. It was my boyfriend. I told the operator that he had showed up and I wanted to call him to tell him not to get out of his car, fearing this guy might attack him, but before I could even do anything, he was already getting out and coming over to my side. I started rolling down my window. I was never thankful for manual windows till then, and before I could start explaining what happened, the guy behind me burned out, getting as close as he could to my car. As he drove away, I explained this to the operator as I got out of my car. I hugged my boyfriend as I tried explaining to him through tears what happened when an officer showed up as well. I went over everything, but since it was dark and he took off so fast, I couldn't get a plate number and I could barely tell what kind of car it was other than it was a dark color. The officer stayed with us as my boyfriend helped change the tire. Since the car went in the direction we needed to go, he followed us for a good distance until we were back in the city on a main road. We got home with no incidents after that, and we talked about it a bit more. My boyfriend told me that after he got off the phone with me, he felt uneasy, so after a while, he texted me to check in, and when I didn't respond, he tried calling. Again, when I didn't answer, he decided to go find me based on the info I had given him. I have never been happier that he made that choice, and from then on, if he did something like that, I never thought twice about it. I bucked up and started taking the main highway from then, and also changed to online classes where I could. That was easily the most terrifying thing to ever happen to me. I've never ran into this guy again, and I hope I never do. Way back when I was a kid, between the ages of 6 all the way to the time I was 12, I lived with my grandparents at their house in the suburbs of Missouri. This house was more or less ancient. I have no idea when it was built, but thinking back on it now, the structures were definitely dated, and the overall setup for the house was definitely old-fashioned. For those 6 years, it was myself, my mother, and then my younger brother that all lived there, with him coming into the picture a year or so before we moved out into our own place. My father was an incredibly drunk and abusive man, and we ended up having to move into my grandparents' house after he attacked my mother and I tried to intervene. Like I said, I was 6, so there was no way I was going to be able to stop him or even slow him down, but he decided that he needed to treat me like a threat and defend himself. Thankfully, that was the end of it for my mom, and she took the proper legal actions to get him out of our life, and we got out of that house. Of course, living with my grandparents wasn't really ideal. Their house wasn't huge by any definition of the word, and my mom was sleeping in an unfinished basement while they set up my bed in what they called the guest room. I'm not sure what guest would have wanted to stay in the room because it had enough space for my child-sized bed and a single dresser in my tiny toy chest, and that was about it. But it was where I called home for a significant portion of my childhood, and I'm thankful that we had a place to sleep at night, though that's where things kind of got sketchy. Sleeping, that is. When we first moved into the house, I had a lot of trouble sleeping in my room. It was a long time ago, so a lot of what happened in the beginning were things that I was told by my mother. She told me that for the first couple of months of us living there, I would sleepwalk. The first time it happened, I had seemingly gotten out of bed, left the guest room, and walked down to her bedroom, and then just stood there in the doorway staring at her. She said that when she asked me if I was okay, I just stared and said that I needed to make sure nothing happened to her. Now, this was right after we had moved in, so not long after the whole event with my father took place. So, she assumed it was some kind of traumatic response to the event, and she had me sleep in her bed with her. Then, the next time it happened, she told me that she actually found me outside the house in the backyard, just staring out into the yard. I wasn't saying anything. I didn't seem scared or angry. I was literally just standing there and staring out into the night. And once again, when she came out and asked what I was doing, I just said that I was watching, but I wouldn't say what I was watching. After this, my grandparents installed a lock on the exterior doors that was too high for me to reach, so I never went back outside, but I did sleepwalk a few more times. It was more of the same, just me saying I was checking on mom, watching, staring out the window. Weird stuff for sure, but it wasn't where it all ended. This is actually where my memory comes into play, because I remember all of what happened after this very vividly. I would randomly start having these horrifying nightmares about various things, but they would always involve my dad. In these nightmares, it was always me at my dad's house. I would be sitting there and my father would walk into the room with an angry look on his face. But something about him didn't look right. He was angry, but he almost looked devilishly angry. Like he almost looked demonic. Much like I was doing when I was sleepwalking, in the dreams, he would just stand in the far corner of the room watching me. And when I would ask him what he was doing, he would tell me that he was waiting. These nightmares were mostly uneventful beyond this, but something about them always launched me into waking up screaming. My mom would have to run into my room and comfort me for what seemed like forever to get me back to sleep. And when she asked me what was wrong, I would always tell her that Daddy was watching me. These weird dreams apparently went on for almost a year when things started escalating in both my life and my nightmares. Around this time, my father decided that he was tired of playing my mother's games and was trying to force himself back into our lives. He kept playing the "I want to see my son" card, and because my mother hadn't gone through any legal custody claim, it was really difficult for her to tell him no. I hated being around him when I was that age, because every single time I would see him, I would just start to feel this horrible fear that something was happening. Being 7, I didn't know what existential dread felt like, but it was like that. Like this horrible feeling that the situation I was in was bad and was only getting worse the longer I was in it. During this time, the dreams with my father grew darker. He would always be staring at me and telling me that he just wanted to be closer to me in them. Thinking back, this is when I realized it wasn't my father in my dreams, but some kind of entity or demon that was watching me in the form of my father. At this point, I never wanted to sleep, and being a young kid, not sleeping really isn't easy. My mother would try to talk to me as best she could about the whole thing, try to help me understand that they were just dreams and that they would eventually pass. I tried to tell her that they weren't just dreams, that this thing was trying to hurt me, but she didn't want to entertain the thought. Around my 8th birthday was when everything came to a head. My father was more pushy about seeing me, and the once a week thing had become several times a week. He would come into the house and would try to get my mom alone in her room, and I don't want to get into what I believe happened. But he would also come to my room and just sit there on my bed while I sat on my toy chest. These were the worst times because he wouldn't say anything. He would just stare at me and go through what looked like an entire cycle of emotions. He would be mad at me, he would start crying, laughing, and it was terrifying. The last time he came over, we went through the same cycle as always. He came in and just sat there, but I was at a point where I have had enough of this, and I asked him why he never wanted to talk to me. He told me to hush because he was thinking. Of course, I was 8 and was starting to be the snappy preteen that kids so often become, and I basically said that it was creepy how he just stared at me. Then he hit me. He smacked me across the face hard enough to leave my cheek red, and then grabbed me by the shoulders and told me that I needed to never speak to him like that again. I remember that feeling, the pain on my face, the anger on his face while he shook me and said that. I remember that horrible fear as I held back from crying, and he just stared at me in the eyes. I just said I was sorry. I didn't know what else to say or do. I remember then seeing his eyes as he stared at me. Something felt different. He felt like he used to in my dream, like a monster. For that split second, I was more terrified than I had ever been, and then he seemed like himself again. He let go of me and started to leave. That was one of the few times he told me that he loved me, and then he was gone. 2 things happened that night. The first one I'll mention is the dream that I had. It was similar to the other dreams I would have about my father, except this time, he wasn't just standing there and staring at me. He was sitting on the floor. The house wasn't our house as I remembered it. It was trashed and dark. I just remember that he was sitting there on the floor, holding his knees and crying. I asked him what happened, why was he so upset, and the words I got in return have always haunted me. I let it win. For some reason, I knew what it was that he was talking about. It was that demon that had been haunting me ever since we moved out of the house, that demon that was haunting him. I don't know why, but in the dream, I felt compelled to forgive him, so I did. I told him that it was okay, that I knew it wasn't his fault. That was pretty much the end of the dream. Nothing else happened past that, but then the morning came, and when I got up, I found my mom crying at the kitchen table. As I came to find out, my father had passed away that night, and as was explained to me much later in life, he had actually ended his own life. He didn't leave a note or tell anyone what was going on. He just went through his plan, and his neighbors called the cops because they heard it. At the age I was, I knew what death was, but I wasn't at the point where it really hit me that he was gone until a bit later. That night was actually the last time I had one of those dreams with him in it. I never had another nightmare about him watching me, or even one like I did that night. Now, I don't know if this was demonic possession, and I'm not trying to make an excuse or rationalize what he did, but part of me feels like my father's aggression wasn't always his. He was not a good man. He drank a lot, and like I said, he attacked both me and my mother, but part of me feels like something else was controlling him. The fact that he had hit me that day and his whole demeanor changed, followed by that weird dream with him telling me that it won, it just makes me feel like there was more to this. Regardless, I hope that my father was able to rest, and while he may have ruined my childhood, and part of me will always pull those bad memories to the front, the other part of me wants him to know that I do forgive him. This actually happened to me a few years ago. I started working at a local gas station part-time after high school. I figured if I'm staying home, might as well do something productive and make my own money too. Most shifts were at night, so they were either dead or full of drunks, but I usually worked with one other person, so it wasn't too bad, especially when we had people get out of hand. I actually liked it for the most part. On the slow nights, I let the neat freak come out in me, and I started to organize the shelves better so that everything is lined up right, not scattered around and piled up. There was one guy, Mark, that usually worked the night shifts with me, and he'd play music on his phone, so it wasn't completely silent, which was nice. One downfall, though, was that I didn't have a car anymore, as mine finally died on me, so I had to rely on rides from my parents, friends, or sometimes an Uber to get me to places. Still, it was manageable because I only lived a few miles away from my home, so I could even walk there. I believe it was in late September when this happened because it wasn't too hot, but it started getting cooler overnights. I had decided to walk to work since it was nice out, and my parents weren't home to take me anyways. It was a normal shift, except it was also football season, so we were a bit busier before games started, dead while it was on, and then we'd get a quick burst of people at the end. As I'm ringing people up, I looked up to see my line, and I noticed a guy in basketball shorts, socks with sandals on, and a shirt that said something about a gun show. Eye roll, am I right? He was looking right at me and smiling, so I just smiled back and continued working on the line. After a few, I looked back and noticed the line wasn't going down, so I called for Mark to come up and help. Sandal Guy was up next. I noticed he had one of those tall cans of tea and nothing else, and he was still smiling, so I just said, "Sorry you had to wait for just this." Without taking his eyes off of me, he said, "Oh, it's all right, sweetie, as long as I get to see your beautiful smile." I haven't really dated much, nor have I had much experience in flirting, so I didn't really know how to react. Not to mention, he had to be close to my parents' age, so I just made some weird chuckle sound and didn't say another word. He paid with a card. I handed him his receipt without saying another word to him, and he said, "Good night, sweetie," and walked out. I didn't have time to process what happened, as I had a few more people in line, so I just continued until we cleared out again. When I was done, I was about to ask Mark to help me with something when he said, "Oh, sure, sweetie." He was a nice guy. We never had problems with each other, so I knew he was teasing, but it snapped me back to that when I started laughing and asked, "So you saw that too? Was that not weird?" He said he thought the dude was weird, but the flustered side of me was adorable. Funny to him, but I didn't know what to say, and the guy was just off, so none of that was enjoyable. Our night went back to normal for a while. He was in the back again as he did some of the bookwork while I was messing with the shelves. We were kind of shouting back and forth about something that we were both really involved in when someone came in. I started walking back around the corner when I noticed it was Sandal Guy again. He noticed me and waved, so I waved back, and he started quickly walking towards the coolers in the back. I quickly made a comment to Mark about him being there and just waited for the dreadful checkout. He walked up to the counter and said, "I forgot to get gas." If that was the case, why did he walk to the back? I just smiled and rang him up. As I handed him his receipt, he made sure to reach further in to touch my hand and said, "I'm glad I decided to stop here tonight," and smiled as he shook my hand. My hand was limp because I wasn't interested in this at all. At this point, Mark had walked out from the back and said, "Hey Kate, my part's done, I'll take over." Thank God. I pulled my arm back real quick and dashed to the back and waited. I didn't hear another word from the guy, but I heard the bell on the door, and then Mark walked to the back. He said when I turned around, the guy cocked his head like he was trying to look at my ass when he walked in front of his view. He said when he noticed this, he grabbed his candy and dashed out the door. Who does this right in front of people? Anyways, the rest of the night was okay again. Had some lady come in singing and got Mark to sing, so that was funny. So we were having a good time. It was getting close to closing, so Mark had taken the trash out back so he could smoke, and I was up front again reading a magazine. To my surprise, Sandals walks in again. It had to show on my face that I was not okay with this, but he again immediately smiled and was looking around quickly like he was trying to find something. That's when he grabbed another candy bar and said, "For you, Catherine Lee. I can't stay away. Can I give you a ride home so we can talk?" I was shocked. My name badge says Kate. I don't go by Catherine or my middle name, so how would he have known that? I didn't know how to reply, so I just said, "No thanks, I have a ride." To which he said, "But you walked here, right?" How would he have known that? I just told him I had a ride and he wouldn't stop, saying he wanted to get to know me more and take care of me. I remind you, I was around 19 years old, and this guy could have been my father. I tried cutting him off to ask him if he was going to purchase anything when he tried to reach for my hand again, and I pulled back. At this point, Mark walked back in right as he started pleading. Mark immediately walked over to the guy, telling him he needed to leave. He started shouting as he was being pushed out that he'll wait for me. Mark locked the door and made sure I was okay, but I was just more shaken up than anything. He had me doing some other things from there, like more organizing, stocking anything that was empty, and mopping while he watched the door. He would unlock the door to let people in, then lock it again. At closing, he was finishing the last thing, so I had pulled out my phone and opened Facebook when I noticed I had a friend request. It was Sandals Guy. That's when I figured out where he knew my name from and also realized that my address was on there. I told Mark about this and he suggested he take me home. I did not refuse either. As we left, I was looking around to see if he was waiting, but I never saw anyone. As he was driving, he tried to loosen up the tension and joke with me, but I think we were both worried about it still. Once we got to my place, the lights were on, so I knew my parents were still up, thankfully, and I noticed Mark was still there when I had gone in and locked the door. I thought it was just to make sure I got in okay. After I was in, I changed clothes and went to get something to eat when there was a knock on the door. It was the cops. They were explaining that there was a report of a suspicious person and gave a description of the vehicle and then the person. You know it. It was the same guy. So I had to explain to the cops and my parents what had happened. The cops said they would drive around a few times to make sure he didn't come back, and thankfully he didn't. But they did tell us that if he came back, to call them again. Unfortunately, there was little they could do since he hadn't actually done anything. The next time I worked, though, Mark explained what had happened. He said he noticed a car following us, but didn't want to say anything and scare me. After I got inside, he saw the truck turn the corner onto my road, so he got out of his car and noticed it was the same guy as he was driving by. He said he thinks he recognized him too as he started to speed up. So he had called the cops to report it for us. I was so incredibly thankful for what he did too. Thankfully, we never saw the guy again, so hopefully he got the hint, but you can bet I did a lot of cleanup on my Facebook too. So that, my friends, was another scary story collection. This one being apparently people are just creepy. I guess one of them was kind of ghostly creepy, but still, people are creepy. Can be. I hope you guys aren't. You guys are the good people though, right? I hope so. Anyways, if you did enjoy this video, please do give it a like below. And if you'd like to hear more content like this, consider subscribing. And lastly, don't forget to leave a comment on your thoughts. Let me know if you liked it. If you didn't like it, what didn't you like about it? And with that being said, friends, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your week. And until next time, take care.